Tonight on the Midnight Drive, we're stepping outside for a moment. Not far, just far enough to see things differently. Imagine looking out the window and seeing the Earth. Not as a map, not as a place that we live, but as something whole, but something small and something quiet from this vantage point. Everything that you've ever known contained in a single view. No borders, no noise, no sense of distance between places that once felt far apart. Just one planet, suspended in the dark. Some astronauts have described a shift that happens in that moment, a kind of clarity that's hard to explain and even harder to hold on to once they return. A realization that doesn't change the world itself, just the way you see it. There's a moment that comes up a lot in astronaut interviews. Not during the launch, not during the mission itself. After. When they're back on the ground trying to explain what it all felt like. And the strange thing is, they don't usually talk about technology. They don't talk about the training. They don't even talk about the danger. They talk about what they saw. Not in a technical sense, but in a personal one. Looking back at Earth. There's a kind of pause that happens when they describe it. Like they're searching for language that doesn't quite exist. Because it's not just a view, it's a shift. From the surface, everything feels large. Cities feel permanent. Countries feel defined. Problems feel immediate. You live inside those scales, so they make sense. But from orbit, that scale disappears entirely. Borders aren't visible. You can see weather systems moving across entire regions in real time. Cloud formations stretching across oceans. Light from cities, but no clear separation between one place and another. It all just starts to blend. Not in a vague way either, in a very precise way. You can see it all so clearly. It's just different than what you're used to. And something about that difference changes the way people think. There's actually a term for it. It's called the overview effect. It's been described by astronauts across several different missions, different countries, different decades. The details vary, but the core feeling doesn't. The sense that the divisions we spend so much time focused on don't translate from that distance. That everything is part of a single system, fragile, contained, connected in ways that are easy to ignore when you're inside of it. It's not always described in dramatic terms. In fact, it's usually the opposite. It's very calm. It's very quiet. It's a kind of clarity that doesn't announce itself at all. It just settles in. Some astronauts talk about feeling responsibility. Not an assigned responsibility or a formal one, just a recognition that the planet that they're looking at is the only one like it that we know of. That everything happening that we know of is happening right there. There's no separation. There is no outside. It's just this. Others describe something more personal, a shift in how they think about their own lives. Problems that once felt overwhelming start to feel smaller. Not necessarily unimportant, just placed differently, seen in a different context. There's also a kind of tension in that experience, because it's one thing to see something from that perspective, but it's another to come back, to return to the same structures, the same systems, the same day-to-day concerns, and try to hold on to that clarity. Some people say it just fades. Not completely, but enough that it becomes harder to access. Like a memory that still exists but doesn't feel as immediate. Others say it stays with them. In small ways, like how they make decisions, how they think about conflict, and how they relate to other people. It doesn't turn them into different people overnight necessarily, it just adjusts the way that they see things. And that adjustment can be really hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. Because it's not something you can replicate very easily. You can look at images, you can watch footage, you can see the Earth from space in high resolution. But it's not the same as actually being there. Not the same as seeing it with your own eyes. Through a window, with nothing between you and that view except glass. There's also something else happening in that moment, something that people don't talk about as much. It's space itself. Not the idea of it, the actual environment. The darkness of space. The scale of space. When astronauts describe looking out, they're not just seeing the Earth, they're seeing everything around it. Or more accurately, the absence of everything around it. There's no atmosphere in the way we're used to. No diffusion of light. The contrast is much sharper. The blackness is much deeper. It's not the kind of darkness you experience at night on Earth. It doesn't have the same softness to it. It's more complete, more encompassing. And in that contrast, Earth stands out even more. It's bright. It's colorful. It's active. Against something that feels so still. That contrast can be incredibly grounding, but it can also be unsettling. Because it reframes everything. You're not just looking at a planet, you're looking at it in context. And that context is vast. It's difficult to fully process. There are also practical details to add to all of this. The speed of orbit, for example. The way the planet literally moves beneath you. Sunrise and sunset happening more frequently than we experience from here. Time behaving differently in small but noticeable ways. All of it contributes to a sense that you're outside of the normal frame, observing instead of participating. And that separation creates space for reflection. It's not a forced reflection or a structured one, it's just available. So available that it's almost forcing you to look at it. And you have time to look at it, to sit with what you're seeing, to notice things that don't stand out when you're inside them. That's where the shift happens. Not in a single moment, but over time, accumulating, layering, until something clicks into place. And once it does, it's hard to fully undo. Even if the intensity fades, even if the day-to-day takes over again, that perspective is something that's still there. It's somewhere in the background. You carry it with you, even if you can't always explain why, which raises a question. If distance can change perception that much, what does that say about how we see things when we're close to them? What do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments below wherever you might be listening tonight. reach out to us on our hotline, The Midnight Drive, 402-610-2836. When we're literally inside the details, inside the noise, inside the structures that we've built around ourselves, how much of what feels fixed is really just a matter of perspective? And how different would it feel if we could step outside of it, even for a moment, long enough to see it the way those astronauts did? What a wild thing to consider, isn't it? You know, there is a point where that perspective starts to settle in. Something shifts, and once it does, it's really hard to see things the same way again. But there's another side to all of it. One that doesn't get talked about near as often because it doesn't fit so neatly into something hopeful or reflective. It sits closer to the edge of uncertainty. When you're looking at Earth from that distance, you're not just seeing the planet. You're seeing it surrounded by something else. Space isn't just empty in the way we tend to imagine. It feels different. The darkness isn't like night. It doesn't fade in at the edges. It doesn't carry the same sense of depth that we're used to. It's more complete than that. More final. And in that kind of environment, small things stand out. Light, it behaves very differently. Movement is easier to notice. There are fewer reference points, so anything that appears becomes immediately significant. Astronauts have reported seeing things that didn't immediately make sense. Not as a central part of their mission, not as something they set out to find, just moments, brief moments. Sometimes explained later, sometimes not fully understood at the time. Maybe it was reflections in the glass, ice particles drifting near the spacecraft, debris moving in ways that look unusual from a certain angle. Most of these have very practical explanations, things that make sense once you understand the environment. But in the moment, they don't always feel that way because context matters, and in space, context is very limited. You don't have the same cues that you rely here on Earth. No atmosphere to soften distance, no familiar background to compare against. Just the object, the movement, and your perception of it all. That gap between what you're seeing and how you interpret it create something else, a kind of uncertainty. Not fear necessarily, just more like awareness, or hyper-awareness even. The recognition that you're operating in a place where your usual ways of understanding things don't always apply. And that awareness can sit alongside everything else. Alongside the clarity, alongside the sense of connection. They don't cancel each other out, they exist together, which makes the experience more complex than it's often described. It's not just awe. It's not just reflection. There's also the quiet realization that most of what exists out there is beyond direct human experience. Even now, even with all the technology, even with all the missions, what we've seen is very limited. What we understand is still growing. And that doesn't have to be framed as something dramatic. It can be very simple, actually. There's more out there than we've encountered. So much more. And we're still in the process of learning how to interpret what we do encounter. That applies to space, but it also applies here on Earth. There's a similar pattern in the ocean. Vast areas that haven't been fully explored. Depths that remain largely unseen. Not because we haven't tried, but because it's ridiculously difficult. The environment resists any type of easy observation. just like space. Pressure instead of vacuum. Darkness that doesn't lift. Movement that's harder to track. And in both cases, when something appears that doesn't immediately fit, the response is very similar. We try to place it. We try to understand it. To fit it into a structure that makes sense. Sometimes we can, other times we cannot. And in those moments where we can't, there's a tendency to fill in the gaps, to assign meaning quickly, to resolve the uncertainty of it all. It's uncomfortable. That instinct doesn't go away just because the environment changes. If anything, it becomes more active because the stakes feel higher. The context is unfamiliar. The margin for error feels smaller. So the mind works faster, looking for patterns, looking for identity, looking for something solid to hold on to. That doesn't mean the conclusions are always accurate, but it shows how the process works, how perception and interpretation are tied together. Especially in environments where we don't have full control or full understanding. And that brings back to the perspective shift itself. Because what astronauts describe isn't just about seeing Earth from a distance. It's about what happens when that distance removes certain assumptions. When it strips away the layers that we usually rely on and leaves something much more direct, more immediate. That can be grounding. Seeing the planet as a whole, recognizing how everything connects, but it can also be so disorienting. Realizing how small everything actually is, how contained, how exposed, floating in something much larger. That combination is where the experience really lives. Not in one extreme or the other, but in the balance between them. Clarity and uncertainty. Connection and isolation. Understanding in the limits of our understanding. And then, eventually, there's the return. Back through the atmosphere. Back into the structure of everyday life. Back into the systems that felt so different from that distance. The same roads, the same routines, the same conversations. On the surface, absolutely nothing has changed. But internally, something has. Even if it's subtle. Even if it's difficult to describe. There's a reference point now that didn't exist before. A way of seeing things that sits just behind everything else. Not always active, but it's still there. And it shows up in small moments. Looking at the sky. Thinking about distance, considering how much of what we experience is shaped by where we are in relation to it. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, contextually, which leaves us with something to sit with. Not a conclusion, not a statement, just a shift in perspective that maybe doesn't require leaving the planet to access. Maybe it requires just stepping back, even slightly, long enough to notice how different things look from the outside, and how quickly they change when you step back in. Because most of the time, we're moving through familiar spaces, operating on patterns we've learned, assuming stability because it feels consistent. But that consistency depends on perspective, doesn't it? To realize how much of it we've only ever understood from within.